You find yourself drifting, slowly, into the 12th century, a Europe that feels both familiar and impossibly strange, where faith and superstition walk hand in hand, where kings argue with popes, and where common people live by the rhythms of the land, the church bell, and the endless uncertainty of the seasons. It is the year 1212, a year remembered for famine, storms, and strange prophecies whispered across towns and villages. You imagine yourself in a small French settlement, perhaps near the River Loire, where the peasants are murmuring about miracles and omens. The air is thick with stories, because in this century, stories are not mere entertainments, they are lifelines, explanations for why crops fail, why children fall ill, why armies rise and fall, why God seems at times merciful and at other times impossibly distant. You see, the crusading movement had already gripped Christendom for over 100 years. Since Pope Urban II's call in 1095, entire generations had grown up with the idea that the Holy Land, Jerusalem, was a prize worth dying for. You can picture it, villagers listening to a preacher describe the city as glowing with divine light, its stones kissed by Christ himself. The imagination of ordinary men and women was caught in a net of faith, longing, and the occasional promise of redemption from sin. And yet, by 1212, the great crusading efforts had not gone as planned. Jerusalem, once seized by the First Crusade, had been retaken by Muslim forces. Saladin's victory at Hattin in 1187 was still remembered with a kind of hushed grief. The Third Crusade, with the formidable figures of Richard the Lionheart and Philip of France, had failed to reclaim Jerusalem. For the people of Europe, there was a lingering sense of unfinished business, of a promise yet unfulfilled. And into this atmosphere of failure, desperation, and hunger, came the strangest of movements, not led by knights in shining armor, nor by kings with vast treasuries, but by children. Or at least, that is how the story was told. Pause here for a moment. Imagine yourself as one of those children. You are 12, perhaps 13, the son or daughter of a farmer, your feet calloused from walking barefoot across fields, your hands rough from helping with the harvest, your mind filled with sermons that thunder about sin and redemption. You are told, over and over again, that adults have failed where the pure of heart might succeed. You believe, with the unshakable clarity of youth, that if only children, innocent, unsullied, marched to Jerusalem, God would surely grant them victory. It is both heartbreaking and mesmerizing, isn't it? The idea that armies of children, drawn from villages and towns across France and Germany, would set out on a holy journey to reclaim the most sacred city in Christendom. But of course, as with so much of medieval history, what actually happened is shrouded in layers of myth, exaggeration, and distortion. You will soon see that the Children's Crusade may not have been a crusade at all, nor made up exclusively of children, but of the poor, the landless, the restless, and yes, perhaps many who were indeed young. For now, though, let us linger in this opening scene, France and Germany in the early 13th century. The weather that year is said to have been especially harsh. Crops failed in some regions. Famine struck. You can almost hear the sound of the wind howling over barren fields, the quiet sobs of mothers who had no bread to give their children, the heavy silence of fathers who could not answer the eternal question, why? And when suffering grows unbearable, people look for answers. They look for signs, visions, for anyone who might promise that suffering has meaning. In 1212, that promise came in the voices of children, or of those seen as children, young shepherds, young preachers, boys with strange charisma. Their names, as remembered by chroniclers, were Stephen of Cloyes in France, and Nicholas of Cologne in Germany. Let me tell you first about Stefan. He was, so the stories say, a shepherd boy from Cloyes, near the Loire Valley. Only about 12 years old. And he claimed that he had received a letter from Jesus himself, yes, a letter, given by a pilgrim dressed as a poor man. You may raise your eyebrow at this, a physical letter, carried by Christ through an anonymous wanderer? And yet, the villagers believed. For why not? The Gospels were filled with miracles, and in an age when literacy was rare, a written word itself could feel miraculous. Stefan preached that he had been called to lead a crusade of children, whose purity of soul would succeed where hardened warriors had failed. Crowds gathered around him. Imagine the scene, a thin, barefoot boy with a kind of unearthly conviction, standing in the village square, the crowd pressing closer, mothers clutching their infants, fathers lowering their heads, children staring with wide, unblinking eyes. The word spread, carried from village to village, and soon hundreds, perhaps thousands, began to gather. They would march south, across France, to the sea, where, they believed, the waters themselves would part for them, just as the Red Sea had parted for Moses. God, surely, would make a way. And at the very same time, far away in Germany, another movement was forming. This one led by Nicholas, a boy of about 10 years old, from Cologne. Nicholas too preached that he had been chosen to lead a holy march to the Holy Land. His followers were said to number in the thousands. Whole families joined, though again, the chroniclers tell us most were the poor, the landless, the young, those who had little to lose, and perhaps only hope to gain. Now, pause again. It is easy to let cynicism creep in. You might say, surely, this is madness. Surely no one believed a child could lead them across continents. But here is the thing, the Middle Ages were not an age of rational plans and cautious calculations. They were an age of faith. An age when a child's vision could move a crowd as surely as a king's decree. So here, at the threshold of our story, we see two rivers forming, one in France, one in Germany, each gathering strength, carrying with them the poor, the desperate, the young, the dreamers. And together, these rivers of humanity would begin to flow toward the Mediterranean Sea. You may already sense it, the haunting irony, that the sea would not part, that the journey would not end in Jerusalem, that suffering would follow suffering. But let us not rush ahead. For now, let us walk with them, slowly, through the villages and towns, through the hot summer of 1212, as Europe watched in wonder at this strange pilgrimage of children. You step further now into the heart of 1212, the year of strange processions. If part 1 was the gathering of clouds, then part 2 is the storm itself, though still wrapped in the quiet bewilderment of faith. The stories diverge, depending on which chronicler you trust. And medieval chroniclers, you should know, were not the most reliable witnesses. They loved a good miracle, or a scandal, or a tale that might serve as a sermon. Still, they leave us enough fragments to piece together the journeys of Stephen of Cloyes in France and Nicholas of Cologne in Germany. Let us begin with Stephen's march in France. Imagine the Loire Valley in early summer, fields stretching wide and golden, but with harvests uncertain. A crowd of boys and girls, perhaps 1,000 at first, gathers around Stephen. Some are no more than 12 or 13 years old, others older, perhaps young men and women barely into adulthood. They set out southwards, singing hymns, chanting, carrying wooden crosses and rough banners stitched with crude symbols of the cross. The image is almost too surreal to take seriously, isn't it? Children marching in lines along dusty roads, their bare feet blistering, their voices cracking in hymns. And yet, as they passed through villages, more joined them. Parents sometimes followed, carrying sacks of bread, uncertain but unwilling to let their children vanish alone. You, the listener, might wonder, did they truly expect to reach Jerusalem on foot? Yes, they did. Faith is a curious thing. They believed that when they reached the sea, the waters would part. The Bible stories they had heard in church, of Moses, of miracles, felt to them not distant, but immediate, as though God were still ready to break the laws of nature for those who were pure of heart. And Stephen himself? Chroniclers say he walked at the head, thin, pale, with eyes shining. Whether he truly believed his own message or whether he was swept along by the power of it, we cannot know. But we can guess. Children often believe with an intensity that adults have forgotten. Perhaps Stephen really thought the sea would open. Perhaps he could almost see it. Their journey took them toward Marseille, the great port city of southern France. Think of the distance, over 600 miles on foot. Through villages, over rivers, across forests, under the burning summer sun. Hunger was constant. Sickness too. Yet they pressed on. And when they finally reached Marseille, the exhausted crowd gazed at the endless expanse of the Mediterranean. And here, of course, the miracle did not come. The waters did not part. The sea stayed as it always was, blue, wide, indifferent. Imagine the silence of that moment. Hundreds of children and poor folk, standing on the shoreline, staring at the horizon, waiting for the waves to draw back. But nothing happened. Some accounts say they prayed for days, refusing to believe it had all been in vain. Others say they began to disperse, drifting back to their homes, or seeking shelter in the port city. A few, more tragically, may have fallen victim to unscrupulous merchants who promised ships to the Holy Land, ships that instead carried them into slavery in North Africa. The sources differ, but the shadows in the story are heavy. And yet, while Stephen's march faltered at the shore, Nicholas's journey in Germany was still unfolding. Nicholas of Cologne was perhaps even younger than Stephen, though the details are unclear. His charisma, however, was undeniable. Thousands are said to have gathered to him. They marched south through the Rhineland, then across the Alps toward Italy. Now pause and picture this. Thousands of boys, girls, families, the landless poor, trudging across the Alps. The Alps, with their snow-capped peaks and treacherous passes. These were not soldiers. They had no armor, no training, little food. And yet, they pressed on. The journey was brutal. Many died along the way, succumbing to cold, hunger, and exhaustion. And yet, some of them did make it as far as Genoa, the bustling Italian port city. There, Nicholas's followers too expected the sea to open. But again, the waters remained closed. Some returned home, broken and disillusioned. Others stayed in Italy, settling into unfamiliar towns, far from Cologne. Chroniclers suggest that a small number may have even managed to travel onward, though not to Jerusalem, perhaps to Rome, where they sought the Pope's blessing. Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful men of the Middle Ages, is said to have met some of them. And what did he say? He is reported to have praised their faith but told them, gently, to return home, for their zeal was not enough without strength and wisdom. It is a strange thing, isn't it? To imagine ragged, hungry children, sunburned and weary, standing before the greatest religious authority in Europe, and being told to go back. One wonders if any of them actually made it home. But here is where the story turns even murkier. Were these really children? Or were they called puri, a medieval Latin term that could mean not just children, but the powerless, the landless poor, the ones without position? Perhaps the Children's Crusade was less about age and more about class. And so we are left with questions. Was it really thousands of children, like some fairy tale gone grim? Or was it a march of the desperate poor, dressed in the metaphor of childhood by chroniclers who wished to make a moral point? After all, the Middle Ages loved allegory. The idea of children, innocent and pure, contrasted against the corrupt and failed adults, made for a perfect sermon illustration. Still, even if it was not purely children, it is clear that many were young, and that thousands set out in hope, only to meet suffering. So, in part 2, we see the rise and fall of two charismatic figures, Stephen of Cloyes and Nicholas of Cologne. One leading his followers to Marseille, the other across the Alps to Genoa. Both ending at the sea, staring at waters that would not yield. And you, as the listener, may already sense the melancholy lesson that medieval chroniclers wanted you to feel, that purity alone cannot bend nature, that innocence is not always rewarded, that faith, without prudence, leads only to loss. Yet before we leap to conclusions, let us hold on a moment longer. For part 3, we will step back. We will look at the broader picture. At why this happened, at what conditions created the fertile soil for such movements, at how daily life, famine, and longing all wove together into this strange tapestry of history. For now, imagine once more the shoreline. In Marseille, children staring at the sea. In Genoa, young voices singing, then fading into silence. A summer of hope, ending in sorrow. If you've been following along, dear listener, you may already feel that the story of the Children's Crusade sits in that strange, half-lit place between memory and myth, between chronicler's ink and the living breath of the people who once walked across the dusty roads of France and Germany. By now we have traced the hopeful beginnings, the charismatic figures of Nicholas in Germany and Stephen in France, and we have watched as thousands of boys and girls, perhaps even young peasants' sons, shepherds' daughters, apprentices, and the dispossessed poor, gathered in bands and streams, pouring southward with the dream of touching the holy city of Jerusalem. But as we drift deeper into this tale, we must pause, slow our pace, and consider the wider fabric in which this curious movement was woven. For no crusade, not even one of children, unfolds in isolation. It is always shaped by its time, its fears, its hunger, and the unseen hand of those who profit or despair from its occurrence. Let us, then, explore together the context and complications that surrounded the year 1212, so that we may understand not just the path of the children themselves, but also the soil out of which such a march could possibly grow. The spiritual climate of early 13th century Europe. You must imagine, if you will, a continent heavy with religious fervor. It was only a little more than a century since Pope Urban II had first called upon Christendom to liberate Jerusalem in 1095. That first crusade had stunned the world. Ragged armies of knights and peasants had trudged eastward, had endured hunger, thirst, and massacre, and yet, against all odds, had captured Jerusalem in 1099. That victory, retold in pulpit and marketplace, had become almost mythic itself. And yet, since that fleeting triumph, the holy city had again fallen under Muslim control, and successive crusades had ended in frustration, disaster, or uneasy stalemate. By 1212, ordinary Christians across Europe were weary of lords and kings promising much, spending fortunes, and then returning home defeated. And yet, the yearning for Jerusalem, for that sacred place which was, in the medieval imagination, the very navel of the world, did not fade. If anything, it smoldered more strongly among the common people, those who had little stake in royal politics but who sought salvation, healing, or meaning in their daily toil. So when rumors spread that the children, the pure of heart, would succeed where armored knights had failed, there was a kind of aching logic to it. If corrupt kings and greedy nobles could not bring victory, perhaps innocence would. It was a world that already saw miracles in the relics of saints, in visions of the Virgin, in sudden healings at shrines. Why not a miracle accomplished by children? Hunger, famine, and discontent. But alongside this religious hopefulness, there was a darker backdrop, famine. Europe in the early 13th century was not a land of abundance. Harvests could fail. Winters could be brutal. The years 1211 and 1212, according to several chronicles, had been marked by hunger in parts of France and Germany. Villagers, desperate and gaunt, were often forced to sell their children into servitude to survive. In such a climate, it is not difficult to imagine parents watching their children join a crusade with a strange mix of fear and relief, fear for their safety, yes, but also relief that one less mouth might need feeding at home. For the children themselves, many of whom already lived on the thin edge of survival, the march may not have felt so very different from the hunger and wandering they already endured. A journey south might have seemed no worse than a season of begging. And at least, in this case, there was a dream attached to the hunger, a holy city, a divine calling, a story that made sense of their misery. We must be careful here. It would be easy to picture the Children's Crusade as a vast exodus of well-fed little boys and girls, leaving cozy hearths and tearful parents. In truth, many were already wanderers, beggars, orphans, or peasants' children accustomed to hardship. Their innocence was real, yes, but their lives were often already marked by struggle, skepticism and opposition. Not all voices in 1212 cheered this march. Some churchmen and chroniclers looked on with horror, even disgust. Foolishness, some muttered. Madness, said others. The official church hierarchy, so often concerned with order and obedience, saw danger in an uncontrolled movement of thousands. For children to set off without papal sanction, without knightly guardians, was to invite chaos, exploitation, and perhaps even heresy. Indeed, some sermons of the time warned against false prophets misleading the young. Nicholas in Germany and Stephen in France may have been treated by some followers as holy leaders, even miracle workers. But to wary bishops and abbots, they looked suspiciously like rabble-rousers, the kind of figures who might spark heretical sects or peasant uprisings. This tension, between the grassroots enthusiasm of ordinary folk and the guarded suspicion of the institutional church, is one of the great complications of the Children's Crusade. And it reminds us that medieval Christendom was never one single voice. It was a chorus, often out of tune, sometimes singing against itself. Merchants, opportunists, and exploiters. Here, dear listener, we reach one of the darker shadows of the tale. For any movement of people, especially children, especially the poor, invites exploitation. And the chronicles whisper of merchants, shipmasters, and unscrupulous men who saw profit in this wandering multitude. Some stories tell of shipowners in the port of Marseilles who offered to ferry the children across the Mediterranean. 7 ships, the tales say, were filled with eager boys and girls, singing hymns, dreaming of Jerusalem. But according to several chroniclers, 2 of those ships sank in a storm, and the rest, instead of carrying the children to the Holy Land, delivered them into the slave markets of North Africa. Whether this story is true in its details is hard to know. But the fact that it was told and retold speaks volumes about the vulnerability of the young crusaders, and the suspicion that their fate was not merely misadventure, but betrayal. Even if this tale is exaggerated, it is almost certain that many children were tricked, sold, or abandoned. Some never made it past Italy or the Alps. Some were absorbed into bands of beggars. Others may have been quietly taken into service by townsfolk along the way. The Children's Crusade, in this light, becomes not just a story of devotion, but also a story of human greed preying upon human hope. The role of geography and distance. Pause for a moment and picture the sheer physicality of the journey. From Cologne or from the Loire Valley to the Mediterranean is not a short stroll. It is hundreds upon hundreds of miles, across mountains, rivers, and hostile territory. Roads were poor, maps were scarce, and provisions were almost non-existent. For children, often barefoot or clad in rough homespun, such a journey would have been brutal even in the best of times. And yet, astonishingly, many did reach Italy. We know this because Italian chroniclers record their arrival. Bands of thin, ragged children appeared in Genoa, in Pisa, in Rome itself. Some demanded an audience with the Pope. Others simply collapsed in exhaustion. The Mediterranean, that dreamed of crossing to Jerusalem, lay before them, and it was here, more than anywhere else, that hope collided with reality. The intervention of Pope Innocent III. And so we come to Rome, and to Pope Innocent III, perhaps the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages. When bands of children arrived, weary and starving, and begged his blessing, Innocent faced a delicate choice. He could not send them on, it was too dangerous. Nor could he fully condemn them, their zeal was undeniable, even admirable. And so he chose a middle path. According to chroniclers, he told the children that their journey, though unfinished, was pleasing to God, that their devotion was a lesson to the sinful adults of Christendom. But he gently dismissed them, advising them to return home. In effect, he sanctified their zeal, but he also drew the line at turning it into action. And so, after months of wandering, hunger, and peril, many of the children turned back, or simply dispersed into the countryside, lost to history. Competing theories and interpretations. Historians, as you might expect, have long debated the Children's Crusade. Was it truly composed of children, or was the term puri, used in some chronicles, more symbolic, meaning simply the poor, or the humble? Were Nicholas and Stephen genuine visionaries, or clever manipulators? Were the stories of ships and slavery fact, or moralizing tales invented later? Some scholars argue that the entire movement may have been more of a popular migration of the poor, later romanticized as a crusade of children. Others insist that children really were the heart of it, that their innocence became both the symbol and the tragedy of the episode. What is certain is that by the end of 1212, the movement had collapsed. No holy city was reached. No armies were defeated. What remained was a trail of hunger, loss, and memory, and a legend that would echo through the centuries. The broader meaning. And so, what do we make of these complications? The Children's Crusade is not just a story of youthful zeal. It is a mirror held up to medieval Europe itself. It shows us the desperation of peasants in a time of hunger, the yearning for miracles in an age of failed crusades, the dangers of exploitation in a world without safety nets, and the uneasy relationship between popular faith and institutional control. It is, in other words, a parable of a continent caught between hope and despair. The children walked, sang, and suffered in that liminal space. And though their march ended in silence, their story has endured, not because of military success, but because it touched a nerve that still resonates, the hope that purity might triumph where power fails. And here, dear listener, let us gently close this third portion of our long and winding tale. You may let your eyes rest, perhaps allow the candle of your imagination to flicker low, for soon, in the final part, we shall look at the legacy of this strange crusade, at how it was remembered, retold, and reshaped across centuries. We shall ask why this story, among so many failures and wanderings of the Middle Ages, has refused to fade from memory. And so, dear listener, we find ourselves at the quiet end of the road, the last flickering candle on the long table of memory, as we look back across the strange, shimmering event that posterity has called the Children's Crusade of 1212. By now you have walked with me through the gathering of thousands, the visions of shepherd boys, the long trudging roads of Europe, and the weary arrival at Italian ports where dreams met their breaking point. Now it is time to exhale, to settle into the gentle aftermath, and to ask, what became of this story? Why did it lodge so deeply in Europe's imagination? And what can it tell us, even now, about the ways human beings remember, retell, and reshape the past? The silence that followed. When the children dispersed, whether back toward their homelands, into the anonymity of begging bands, or into the hands of merchants who trafficked in despair, their march left behind almost no written trace from the children themselves. No letters, no chronicles, no surviving first-person voices. What remains are the echoes of others, the pens of monks, clerics, and later historians. And yet, silence itself is telling. In medieval Europe, silence was often the fate of the poor, the powerless, and the young. Their voices were rarely recorded unless their deeds were woven into the narratives of priests or kings. Thus the Children's Crusade fades into that quiet zone where history and legend intermingle. You can almost hear the stillness, can't you? A hush falling over villages that had watched their sons and daughters vanish down dusty roads, only to find, months later, that they would not be returning. Mothers, perhaps, standing at the threshold in the evening, gazing south, listening for footsteps that never came. The chronicler's versions. Of course, silence invites invention. And the medieval chroniclers did not agree on what had happened. Some wrote that the children's journey had been noble but doomed, a sign that innocence was not enough to win back Jerusalem. Others framed it as a warning, a moral fable against misplaced zeal. Still others, especially in later centuries, embroidered the tale with lurid details of betrayal, shipwreck, and slavery, details that may have been more symbolic than factual, but which nevertheless shaped the enduring myth. The divergence of these accounts tells us something vital about medieval storytelling. It was never only about reporting events. It was also about shaping meaning, about turning history into lessons for the faithful. Thus the Children's Crusade could be told as tragedy, or folly, or inspiration, depending on the teller, the audience, and the purpose. A lesson to the adults. One of the most striking aspects of the legacy is the way the children's seal was held up as a rebuke to adults. Pope Innocent III himself is said to have remarked that the devotion of the young should shame the grown men of Christendom, who had failed to retake Jerusalem. And so, in sermons, the story could be wielded like a mirror. See, even children would sacrifice everything for the holy city, and you, wealthy lords and lazy peasants alike, will not. It was, in its way, a powerful rhetorical tool. The children's loss was transformed into an exhortation for future crusades. Their innocence was conscripted into propaganda, their suffering made to serve the machinery of guilt and inspiration. Myth-making across centuries. As the centuries passed, the story was retold, reshaped, and reinterpreted in ways that tell us more about each new age than about 1212 itself. In the later Middle Ages, the Children's Crusade often appeared as a cautionary tale, a warning against religious enthusiasm unmoored from authority. To preachers wary of heresy and mass movements, the Children's March was a symbol of dangerous folly. In the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, when skepticism about medieval superstition grew, the story was sometimes ridiculed as evidence of credulity, a sign of how childish the entire medieval world had been. And in the Romantic era of the 19th century, poets and writers embraced it as a symbol of purity and doomed idealism. The children became almost saintly figures, tragic innocence lost to the cruelty of the world. Painters imagined long lines of glowing youths marching into the sunset, halos of light over their weary heads. You see, dear listener, how each century found in the story a reflection of its own concerns. Like a mirror carried through time, the Children's Crusade never showed one single face, but rather the shifting features of Europe itself. Echoes in literature and music. The tale inspired not only chroniclers and preachers, but also later artists. In the 20th century, for instance, Bertolt Brecht wrote a play titled Die Kinderkreuzzug, The Children's Crusade, which transformed the medieval event into an allegory for the suffering of children in war. Benjamin Britten later composed a haunting choral work based on Brecht's text, performed by children's voices, evoking the eerie beauty and sadness of innocence crushed by conflict. In such works, the Children's Crusade became less about medieval Jerusalem and more about the timeless vulnerability of youth in the face of adult folly. Whether in the 13th century or the 20th, the image of children marching towards suffering has remained a powerful metaphor. Historical skepticism. Modern historians, ever cautious, have tried to sift fact from legend. Many now argue that the Crusade was not literally composed of children, but of puri, a Latin term that could also mean the poor or the humble. If so, then the story may really have been about dispossessed peasants, wanderers, and landless laborers, swept up in religious enthusiasm. Others argue that children were indeed present, but not exclusively. Instead, the movement may have been a blend of ages, with charismatic leaders like Nicholas and Stephen attracting a wide following of those who had little to lose. Whichever interpretation you prefer, what remains clear is that something extraordinary happened in 1212. Thousands of the powerless, whether literally children or figuratively childlike in their poverty, attempted to seize the holy dream that kings and knights had failed to achieve. The human dimension. Let us, though, step back from theory and return to the human level. For whether they were 10 years old or 20, whether they carried wooden crosses or simple staffs, the marchers of 1212 were human beings who knew hunger, fatigue, and hope. Picture them once more, trudging through alpine passes, singing hymns, clutching one another's hands against the cold. Picture the villagers who gave them bread, or jeered, or shook their heads in disbelief. Picture the ports where they gazed out across the sea, wondering if the waters themselves would part for them, as the Red Sea had for Moses. Their story, at its most basic, is a story of yearning for meaning, for salvation, for a place in a world that had little room for the weak. And in that yearning, perhaps, we can still recognize something of ourselves. The gentle lesson. So what does the Children's Crusade teach us, if anything? Not about military campaigns, for it had none. Not about triumphs, for it ended in dispersal and loss. But perhaps it teaches us about the enduring power of hope, even in fragile vessels. It shows us the danger of misplaced faith, yes, but also the strange beauty of it. For there is something haunting in the image of children believing they could accomplish what armies could not. It is tragic, but it is also deeply human. In the end, the Children's Crusade is less about history and more about the dream of history, the dream that innocence might heal a broken world. That is a dream worth pausing over, even as we let the tale slip back into silence. And now, as our hour together draws to its close, let us let the story fade gently. Imagine the long roads empty once again, the banners tattered and forgotten, the wooden crosses left leaning against a roadside shrine. Imagine the quiet return of daily life in the villages of France and Germany, as parents sowed fields, children herded sheep, and the extraordinary summer of 1212 dissolved into the ordinary grind of survival. History, after all, is mostly silence, punctuated by the rare shout or cry that lingers. The Children's Crusade was one such cry, brief, piercing, unforgettable, but then it too was swallowed by the silence of time. And so, dear listener, we come to the end. You may close your eyes now, if you wish, and let the tale drift away, like a candle guttering at the close of night. May your rest be as gentle as the footsteps of children fading down a long medieval road.